Everyone, hello, welcome in. Thank you so much for joining our Lunch and Learn today about grief and the intersectionality between faith and grief and how it affects our faith. I would like to welcome Kendra and Dan, who will be presenting today's Lunch and Learn. So I will pass it over to Kendra. Now.
Hello, everyone. Bridget, thank you so much for the introduction. I'm Dr. Kendra Yarber, Director of Philanthropy and Grants for CBC. It's an absolute pleasure to be sharing in this Lunch and Learn with you all today. I hope we all learn a lot. So before we explore this really big question of how can grief shake faith, I like to set the foundation for this presentation by having us ask ourselves a couple of questions. What definitions of religion and spirituality are we operating within? How do they function in society, in our communities, and in our personal lives? And do we all mean the same thing when we say religion and spirituality? While we have shared reference points for what religion and spirituality are, it's very important for us to remember that they're both lived experiences by human beings, which leaves a lot of room for the subjective. So one of the ways that I wanted us to kind of start our conversation today is by looking at what comes up when we research or look for definitions for these two terms. So if we were to go to our phones or computers, here's what we would find. So according to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, which is a reliable general source, religion is defined as an organized system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices. Religion is the religious beliefs or observances and social practices found within a given cultural context. It also says that religion is a commitment or devotion to a god or gods, a system of beliefs or religious observance. So what we can see here is that religion is understood to be an organized system, right? It has order. It also has beliefs. So it's concerned with what people believe to be true. There's also observances, what is honored within a religious tradition, what's revered by the people who are part of the religious tradition, and also what's observed. There's also a reference to social practices, which is what do people do socially? What does that social interaction look like? Also, there's culture, and then there's also commitment to or devotion to a god or gods. So there's a recognition of both monotheistic and polytheistic traditions. Now let's move to another definition. So dictionary.com, which I think we may all be familiar with, defines religion in this way. It's a set of beliefs concerning the cause, nature, and purpose of the universe, especially when considered as the creation of a superhuman agency or agencies, usually involving devotional and ritual observances, and often containing a moral code governing the conduct of human affairs. Similar to the first definition, there is reference to a set of beliefs. So that's a consistent, right? When we think about the definition. This one, however, introduces the cause of nature and the purpose of the universe, which is about how life began. So there's an expandedness about this definition that we don't see in the previous one. And then there's also mention of superhuman agency, which is also a reference to the god or gods referenced in the previous definition. And then we also see here that there is a moral code that is referenced, which speaks to morality. So it's a question of how should we behave or act according to what's moral. And then we look at the Cambridge Dictionary, which has a very neat version of all of these. And this one says that religion is the belief in and worship of God or gods or any such system of belief and worship. So what's the so what of us kind of looking at these general everyday references or definitions of religion? The so what is that it's all of these definitions at once. There is no fixed way in which we think about what religion means as a social category, though we do have very defined religions. But it is open to the ways in which people live those things. And so that dynamic component is something that all of these definitions point to. So if we do something similar with spirituality, we see that there are overlaps, of course, but there is something different here, and the definitions do look different. So according to Merriam Dictionary again, we see that spirituality is something that in ecclesiastical law belongs to the church or to a cleric as such. So there is like this pointed definition that is referencing or invoking Christianity. Also, it says that spirituality is sensitivity or attachment to religious values or the quality or state of being spiritual. So there is something about the spiritual being part of spirituality. If we look at dictionary, it also says that spirituality is the quality or fact of being spiritual, incorporeal or immaterial, and predominantly spiritual character as shown in thought, life, and etc. So what we see here is that there is not just a focus on spiritual being of spirituality, but that there is something immaterial and not physical about the ways in which we think about spirituality. And then, of course, this last definition here is about spirituality involving deep feelings and beliefs of a religious nature rather than the physical. So it's very similar to what we see with dictionary.com. So where we see the differences between religion and spirituality, what is important for us to kind of take note by just this simple exercise is that religion can be deeply prescriptive. There are more directives, whereas spirituality holds more space for self-prescribed ways of being and living. And there is more ways and very overlapping ways that human beings can make meaning, especially after loss. And we'll talk more about that later, that blends both this religious and spiritual lens. So I think just to kind of give a quick nugget of what's important from just these first couple of slides here is that the meaning of these terms really point to the fact that there is no real consensus to defining what religion is or can't be and what spirituality is or can't be. Rather, these are very dynamic terms. They require people to live them. And we see that in all the different ways that religion has shaped and been shaped by people through different time periods. So it's something that we would rather say it's open. And let's kind of think through that as we move through the conversation today. So how does religion and spirituality support one's grief journey? What I'd like to underscore for us today is that together, religion and spirituality can inform how a person responds to death. It can inform how people navigate the loss, and it can inform how people manage their grief, which will be discussed a lot more later. But there are many overlapping and distinct components that we should definitely look at when thinking about this intersection of religion and spirituality. So for religion, if a person is grieving in the community and they're part of a religious community or they are part of a particular faith tradition, there are several things that they're able to reach for or use as a tool and resource when going through the grief process or processing grief. Tradition, doctrine, and ritual are very key to this religious framework that I think we should be thinking through today as we talk through the different examples of how religion and spirituality intersect. So if we think about tradition and doctrine and the ritualistic practices, what we would love to point to often are things like funerals. You know, how should we memorialize the deceased? Memorialization, vigils. Some traditions have days of mourning where faith and belief and the life that has been lost is observed and revered and honored. Also, if we think about traditions and rituals, we should also think about different clothing. Clothing is an important part of how we think about honoring and kind of marking this aspect of the life cycle. Also, when we think about the community, bringing food to someone's home who has experienced a loss is also a part of how communities come together and provide themselves and be a resource to people who are experiencing or have experienced a loss. Also, religion provides a grieving individual the sacred texts, the music, the language, and the literature that they can gravitate towards and anchor their grief within. Also, when we think about religious communities, there's something quite unique in the ability to be able to talk about the loss and talk about what's being experienced in relationship to and in relationship with someone who shares the same religious beliefs. So there is this ability to talk about what has happened without necessarily having to explain oneself outside of the tradition, because there is religion is there as a shared language. Also, the question of how do we explain what has happened to someone after they have passed? Religion provides those answers, though not always neat, but there is a baseline of understanding that religion provides for those who are grieving and trying to understand what has happened. And then also, religion provides identifiable religious spaces that individuals can seek out when support is needed. Similarly, if we were to look at spirituality, and if someone is kind of working through grief through a more spiritual or less religious lens, we see some similarities, but there are some differences that I wanted to point out for you. So tradition, personal practice, and ritual are part of that process, and they can be used as tools. So even though someone may not be religious, it doesn't mean that there may not be tradition that is informing their process. Also, personal practice is more readily available for people who may not ascribe to religion, but turn towards their own spiritual way in navigating what has happened. Also, sacred texts, music, language, and literature are also key features of navigating grief through the lens of spirituality. Even though, for example, sacred texts may be part of religion more explicitly, it doesn't necessarily mean that sacred texts aren't used or referenced in the process. Also, if we think about community, there is certain likelihoods where individuals may feel that community is found outside of religious community because they're not part of a particular religion or tradition. So there is an opportunity for individuals who are experiencing a loss to ground themselves around people who may not be religious or may not be part of a practicing community. And then lastly, I'll just note here that spirituality and people who experience this process through a primary or purely spiritual lens may find that they have more ways of acknowledging or more explanations for what has happened because they're not tied to what the religion has prescribed or said has happened at the result of the person's passing. So if we think about questions around afterlife, they can create more possibilities for what may be happening in terms of, you know, their loss and their loved ones and where they are now. And so we'll talk more about that, Dan will, in future slides. So what's the interplay here? The point that I think I want most of us to kind of look at, for us to kind of walk away with, is that spirituality is the space where one can create beyond the religious tradition, or it's a place where we can completely create meaning making apart from what's prescribed within a religious tradition. So think of it as the part that is for me. It's the part that is deeply personal and it's definitely private. It's what people may do outside of community in their private and comfortable spaces where they can be themselves. So think of spirituality that way. Another way we can think about spirituality is where It's religious doctrine that has been metabolized into usable parts that speak to a person on an individual and personal level. Also, it's important to note that this interplay between religion and spirituality is where critical meaning making can take place. And for someone who is grieving, this gives them increased agency over their own grief experience, and it also provides tools for them to process what they are going through. Here, I would like to kind of point us to a piece of literature or scholarship. So this is a quote from T.M. Lerman's How God Becomes Real, Kindling the Presence of Invisible Others. And to this question of how can religious and spiritual practices complicate faith, meaning, and healing after the death of a loved one, I think this quote encapsulates a lot of what we'll be talking about today. It says, "A man who has lost his father must daily say aloud before others that the God who has, in some fundamental sense, caused his pain is good. It is the most obvious feature of prayer that those who pray describe their small griefs and larger struggles and then direct their attention to the ways in which their world is nonetheless good." So, what this quote, I think, illuminates for us is that the complexity of grief encompasses the woundedness that we will talk about today. It does sit alongside confusion, and it can cause tension because in the same space where there is to be an honoring of what has happened, there's also loss and the inability to understand how honoring and accepting pain have to kind of rest together. And it doesn't always rest well. So to close out this section of our conversation, I certainly want to acknowledge those who are and do experience grief that do not necessarily prescribe to religion or do not consider themselves to be spiritual. And I wanted to just call our attention to the rise of the nuns. So some of you may be aware, but about 28% of US adults identify as nuns. And so what does this mean? Nuns, and I think that the play on words is certainly intentional here, but nuns are people who answer a question about their religion by saying that they are atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. And these are also combined with individuals who consider themselves to be religiously unaffiliated. And together, this group are called nuns. Scholars of religion in the US have been using this term nuns since at least the 1960s, and its use has grown common in social scientific journals and the media. So the group of nuns, what's the composite? What does this group look like? So 17% of nuns are considered atheists. So these are individuals who do not believe in God or any other higher power. Agnostics make up 20%. What makes them different from our atheist group is that these individuals are not sure if God or any other higher power exists or not. And then 63% of nuns are considered nothing in particular. So these are individuals who may believe in God or any other higher power, may consider themselves spiritual but not religious, and or they're not involved or affiliated in religious institutions. So how do we support nuns after loss? It is important for us to be mindful of where they stand when it comes to their religious, spiritual, or unaffiliating identities. Offering supportive language that speaks to how they interpret what it means to be a human being is important to their well-being. Also, when we think about supporting nuns in our community, it's important to recognize that community is still important to someone who is experiencing loss. So whether or not they're part of a religious community, it's important to find ways to help them build community, even though they stand outside of certain religious frameworks or are tied to religion in some way. Also, in terms of kind of how we language around loss, nuns often lean on metaphor and symbolism to explain major life events. So rather than deriving meaning from the religious or spiritual, they point to symbolic structures to explain what has happened. And then also, lastly, I'd like to conclude here. Nuns create their own practices. And this is something, of course, that we see across all people. But it's quite a unique experience for nuns to create their own practices to honor and memorialize the deceased as they navigate their grief, because this allows them to derive their own meanings, which we know is important for anyone who is grieving. And explanations of death actually have more alignment with how they view the world and how they think about their own existence. I will pause here to see if there are any questions, and then we will transition over to the second part of the presentation today.
If anyone has any questions, you can submit it in the Q&A. If you also want to raise your hand, click the raise hand option. There's an option that allows you to join in on audio if you prefer to share your question through audio. All right, I'm not seeing any questions.
Okay.
All right. So far we've covered the religious and spirituality component just to give you all a greater depth of the language that we're using, how to define it, and to really focus on the nuns, which I think is a very it's a growing demographic and a one that we don't talk a whole lot about and that many people don't know about. But now we're going to switch our focus to the more clinical and applied aspect of this presentation of how can we support someone who's grieving and also going through a crisis of faith, because this is such a common experience that grief can really shake our faith, our belief systems, our relationships with a higher power, if we believe that. And it can be really, really challenging to work our way through this and build meaning after something so devastating in our lives. I'll share my uh, slides. So this presentation today is not just about understanding grief as an emotional experience. It's about recognizing that grief often reaches much deeper. Grief touches the very frameworks that help people make sense of their lives. And for many, that includes spirituality, faith, or their broader sense of meaning. When someone experiences a significant loss, grief doesn't just show up as sadness. It can disrupt multiple layers of one's inner world. It can shake our sense of attachment. It can shake our identity, our understanding of meaning, and the belief systems we once relied on to feel safe and oriented in the world. And this is where the concept of spiritual wounding becomes very important. So for those unfamiliar with the term, spiritual wounding happens when grief fractures those previously held beliefs about safety, justice, God, or even the basic assumption that life makes sense. So what once felt stable can suddenly feel uncertain or even broken. So as we move through this part of the presentation, I want us to hold on to this idea. Grief doesn't just ask us, how do I feel? It also asks us, what do I believe now? And that question is often where some of the deepest and most complex aspects of grief begin to emerge. So before going further, let's just review these terms and just to frame them in the context of how we can support people. So when we talk about religion, we're referring to something that's structured, communal, and shaped by doctrine. That can include shared beliefs, rituals, and established traditions that people participate in together. Spirituality, on the other hand, is more personal and fluid, as Kendra mentioned. It's about meaning making. It's how individuals make sense of their experiences, their relationships, and sometimes their connection to something larger than themselves, whether or not that includes a formal belief system. What's important to remember is that these are not fixed or rigid categories. These are lived experiences. They're shaped by culture, identity, community, personal history, and for many people, religion and spirituality overlap, and for others, they're completely separate. And for some, neither feels relevant at all. So the practical implication for us as clinicians or support providers is this. We never want to assume what someone believes. We never want to assume how they practice, if they practice at all. And we never want to assume their comfort with spiritual or religious language. So this is taking a very culturally sensitive approach to religion and spirituality. As we begin to recognize spiritual wounding and grief, there are some common ways that it can show up in grieving. For some people, it can look like a crisis of faith. They may begin asking questions like, why would God allow this? Or what kind of world is this where this could happen? For others, it can show up as anger. That can be anger at God, anger at religious systems, or even anger at the beliefs they were taught to trust. Some experience a deep loss of meaning. It's almost an existential collapse, where the world no longer feels coherent, understandable, or safe. On the other end of the spectrum, some people may actually intensify their belief systems. They might cling more tightly to certainty as a way to create stability in the midst of chaos. And we also can see spiritual bypassing, where phrases like, it's all part of a plan are used, and this is sometimes used to avoid fully engaging with the pain of a loss. And for many, there can be a disconnection from religious community altogether. Spaces that once felt supportive may now feel uncomfortable, alienating, or even triggering. So, what's important for us to hold is that these spiritual responses are not pathology. There's nothing inherently wrong with these responses to spiritual wounding. These are often adaptive attempts at trying to create meaning. These are ways that the psyche, our minds, are trying to organize an experience that feels very disorganizing. And our role as supporters and providers is not to correct them, but to understand the function they're serving in that person's grief process. So, as we think about supporting grief, especially when spirituality is involved, it's important that we approach this through a trauma-informed lens. So, first, we want to focus on safety. And that's not just emotional safety, but also existential safety. We want to create a space where people can question, doubt, believe, or not believe without feeling judged or redirected. That also means we avoid introducing or forcing any belief frameworks onto them. Secondly is trust and transparency. We have to be mindful not to impose our own interpretations or subtly guide someone towards a meaning that feels more comfortable to us. The work here is to stay with the person's experiences who we're helping and not to reshape them. Third is choice and agency. So grief often takes away our sense of control. So part of healing is trying to restore a sense of control in our lives. And we do that by allowing clients to define their own meaning rather than offering answers or conclusions for them. Fourth is cultural humility. Faith and spirituality are not universal experiences. They're very different across various cultures, and they're shaped by family, identity, lived experience. So what's comforting for one person may be harmful or irrelevant for another person. And finally, there's empowerment. Our role is to support people in reconnecting with their own internal authority, not telling them what to believe, but helping them to trust their own process of making sense of what has happened. All of these principles of trauma-informed care help us to create a space where grief and spirituality can be explored safely, without pressure or without assumption. So when we begin to support someone navigating grief and spiritual disruption, there's a few core things that can help guide us. First, we want to validate the person's experience without imposing meaning onto it. Instead of trying to explain or reframe what has happened, we acknowledge the impact. We can say something like, it makes sense that this would shake what you believed. That kind of response honors the disruption without trying to fix it. Second is we normalize spiritual struggle. Many people question their beliefs after a loss, even if those beliefs once felt solid. So naming that can reduce isolation. As an example, we can say to someone, many people find themselves questioning their beliefs after something like this. Third is we can create space for ambiguity. One of the most important things we can do is tolerate not knowing. And that's really hard to do because we all want to feel certain, we all want to know, but there's a lot we don't know. So we don't want to rush towards answers or resolution. We want to allow the questions to exist. And that in itself can be stabilizing for a person. And finally, we want to explore the function of the beliefs. Rather than asking whether a belief is right or wrong, we become curious about what it does for the person. So a simple question like, what does this belief give you right now, can open up meaningful reflection without judgment. These types of approaches help us stay grounded in presence rather than moving too quickly into explanation or interpretation. Another important area of support is helping people create and engage in personalized rituals. And these don't have to be formal or religious. And in fact, some of the most meaningful practices are deeply personal. This could look like a memory making experience, engaging in symbolic acts, or creating non-religious rituals that help someone feel connected to the person they lost. We call these continuing bonds. The goal is not tradition for its own sake, but meaning that feels authentic to the person who's grieving. Related to that, we also want to facilitate continuing bonds, as I mentioned. We now understand that healthy grief is not about letting go, but it's about transforming the relationship. And this can include writing letters to the deceased, talking to them internally, or finding ways to integrate their memory into our daily lives. And finally, when appropriate, excuse me, we can support reconnection to community. For some, that might be a religious or spiritual community. For others, it can be something more secular, or even a chosen family of friends and supports. But the key is that connection remains a powerful part of healing, but it has to be aligned with what feels safe and meaningful for that person. And you can help that person discern those kinds of questions of what support feels good for them. So all of these approaches help people stay connected, not just to the person they lost, but also to themselves and to a broader sense of meaning. So it's also important to talk about what not to do when supporting someone going through grief, especially when spirituality is involved. First, we want to avoid correcting someone's beliefs. Even if something they say doesn't align with our own understanding, responding with something like, that's not how it works, can really shut down the conversation and damage trust and safety. We also want to be careful not to over spiritualize the experience. Not every moment of grief needs to be framed in spiritual terms. And by doing that, you can sometimes bypass the emotional reality of what they're going through. Similarly, we should never dismiss spiritual experiences either. Whether it's a dream, a sense of presence, or a belief about the afterlife, our role is not to validate or invalidate the truth of it, but to understand what it means to them. We also want to avoid forcing closure or meaning. So grief doesn't follow a timeline, and meaning making cannot be rushed. It has to happen at its own pace. So pushing someone towards resolution too quickly can actually interfere with the process. And finally, we need to be mindful not to use our own belief systems as a guide. Our role is not to lead someone towards what we believe, but to support them in discovering what feels true and meaningful for them. When we can hold that kind of space, we allow grief to unfold in a way that's more authentic rather than prescribed. So I want to spend a few slides just looking at helpful and unhelpful phrases. And these are things that you have come across, I'm sure, throughout your own grieving experiences, either as someone who's heard them from people trying their best to be supportive. And these are things you might have said as well on your end, trying your best to be supportive, but they can often hit not in the right way. They're the best, even though it's well intended, it doesn't feel supportive. So I just want to go over some phrases and how we can reframe them in more helpful, supportive ways. So related to anything to meaning making or why questions, more unhelpful phrases you can hear or questions could be, why do you think this happened? Sometimes you hear everything happens for a reason. Someday you'll understand. And rather than saying those, it can be more helpful to say things like, what questions has this loss brought up for you? Or it's okay if this doesn't make sense right now. Or we don't have to have answers for this today. Unhelpful language can pressure premature meaning making, which is something we want to avoid, as I mentioned before. These helpful languages support tolerance of ambiguity, which is core to trauma-informed care. We want to help people tolerate not knowing, tolerate ambiguity. We don't want to rush them towards certainty. In the world of spiritual assumptions or faith-based assumptions, you might hear things like, they're in a better place, or God needed another angel, or it's part of God's plan. And these types of assumptions can invalidate or re-traumatize, especially in spiritual wounding. So more helpful things you can say are, what beliefs or ideas bring you comfort, if any at all? How has your faith been impacted by this loss? And are there parts of your belief system that feel supportive right now? If you hear things around spiritual struggle or anger at God, some more unhelpful comments could be, you shouldn't feel that way about God, or you're told to just have faith, or you're told don't question God. And this type of shaming of spiritual struggle can really increase isolation. If someone starts to feel shamed or judged, they're going to pull back from relationships. And in the context of grief, it can be so detrimental because we need support, we need connection. And if we're feeling shame about what we're thinking, what we're feeling, it can be very hard to connect to someone. So, in more helpful ways, we can say things like, it makes sense that you might feel angry or conflicted. Or we can ask them, what has this experience been like for your belief systems? Or you can say, there's space here for all of those questions. So these are much more open, much more welcoming. There's not a judgment built into anything here. If you come across things related to presence, experiencing the presence of a loved one through dreams, signs, or connections, some unhelpful phrases could be, that's not real, that's just your imagination, or saying they're definitely visiting you. So we want to avoid both dismissal, outright dismissal, and outright confirmation because we don't know. These are our own belief systems being built in. So we want to lean more towards meaning making and not make any decisions around certainty, whether something is or is not true or happening. So more helpful things could be saying like, what is that experience like for you? Or how does that connection impact how you feel? Or what meaning do you make of that? So these stay more in the realm of curiosity and just being interested in what this person is experiencing as they're talking to you. And to give a nod to the nuns, so those are the atheists, the agnostics, the unaffiliated, some unhelpful phrases or questions that you might hear towards them is, do you believe in an afterlife? Or being told that your loved one's watching over you, or to tell them you'll see them again. And these are unhelpful because they don't respect the person's worldview. They're not being attentive to how they make sense of grief, of loss, of afterlife. So it's more helpful to focus on legacy, to focus on impact, connection, and not imposing a belief system on people who don't have a belief system. So instead, a more helpful approach could be asking the person, how do you make sense of what happens after death? Or how do you stay connected to their memory? Or what do they continue to mean in your life? There's a very important shift in these types of questions because they're far more open, they're far more curious. It's more about learning rather than having a preconceived idea. And we also want to give attention to the children and really be mindful of developmentally sensitive language. So some unhelpful phrases that you can hear is telling a child that their loved one went to sleep, or they're told that God took them, or they're told to be brave for your family. So children need clarity and emotional permission. And if you do metaphors like they're in a better place, they went to sleep. This can create a lot of uncertainty. It can create guilt. It can create fear. It makes it very confusing for them, and they're already going through something very painful. So, what's more helpful for children is things that are honest, that are direct, are concrete. So, you can say things like, their body stopped working and they died. You can say sometimes people die and it's not because of anything you did. So you want to make sure that they understand it's not their fault. You can tell them that it's okay to feel sad, confused, or even angry. And these are things that are much more easier for the child to hear, but they're harder for us to say because they really get to the difficulty of talking about grief and loss. So a simple way to anchor all of what we've talked about in practice, is helpful to think about how the shift in how we respond. So our instinct often is to explain, to reassure, or to redirect. And we want to make things make sense. We want to help people to feel better or guide them towards what feels like a healthier place. But when it comes to grief work, especially when spirituality is involved, those instincts can sometimes move us too quickly away from the person's actual experience. So instead, we need to shift our approach. So what we do is we validate by an example of saying, that makes a lot of sense. We explore with the person. You can say, tell me more. We normalize the experience. We say, you're not alone in that. We open space. We say, we don't have to solve this today. You take the pressure away. And these types of responses help us stay present with the person rather than trying to move them somewhere else. We're really in the moment and with them. And that presence is often where the real work of grief begins. The goal is not to replace unhelpful statements with perfect ones. The goal is to shift from certainty to curiosity, from fixing to presence, and from answers to relationship. When we're working with children, it's important to understand how they make sense of the world, especially when it comes to loss. Children tend to think in very concrete ways, and they often engage in what we call magical thinking. And that means they may interpret events in ways that are literal, or they may believe their thoughts or actions somehow caused what happened. So, because of this, it's very important that we are clear. So, we want to use direct language like died rather than softer words like passed away, because passed away can be confusing, or some words can be frightening to a child because they don't really understand. We also want to normalize their questions. Children are very curious, and when it comes to death, they can be especially curious. And they may ask questions about God, where the person is, what happens next. And these questions aren't a problem to solve. We don't have to have all the answers, but they're more an opportunity to support their understanding in a way that feels safe and grounded. As far as interventions, children express themselves differently than adults. So we want to create a space for expression through drawing, through play, through music, through storytelling. And these are ways children process and communicate their inner world. From a spiritual perspective, we need to be especially mindful of the language we use. Phrases like God took them can be confusing or distressing, and it can lead to fear or misunderstanding. So overall, our role is to provide clarity, emotional permission, and a safe space for them to explore what they're experiencing in ways that are developmentally appropriate. When we shift into working with adolescents, the landscape becomes a bit different. Adolescence is a time of identity formation where young people are actively trying to figure out who they are, what they believe, and where they fit in the world. It's also a stage where questioning authority, including religious or spiritual authority, is developmentally appropriate. So when grief enters the picture, it often intensifies those processes. You may see strong emotions like anger, doubt, or confusion, especially around belief systems that once felt given or unquestioned. Our role as supporters is to validate those responses, not shut them down. Anger, questioning, and even rejection of previously held beliefs can all be part of a healthy grieving process. We also want to create space to explore belief systems without pressure. And this isn't about guiding them toward a specific conclusion, but it's about supporting them in thinking critically and personally about what feels true for them. As far as interventions, adolescents can benefit from reflective and relational tools. So, journaling can help them process internally. Peer discussion or peer support groups can normalize their experience and reduce isolation. And identity-based exploration allows them to connect their grief to larger questions of who they are becoming in the world. From a spiritual perspective, it's important to expect some level of polarization. Some adolescents may reject belief systems entirely, while others may deepen their commitment as a way to find stability. And both responses are valid. Our role is to support the process, not direct the outcome. When we're working with adults, grief often shows up within much more complex meaning systems. Adults typically have established beliefs about the world, their roles, their relationships, and their sense of identity. So when a significant loss occurs, it doesn't just impact how they feel, it can disrupt how they understand themselves and their place in the world. You can see shifts in identity, especially if the loss changes a major role, like being a partner, a parent, or a caregiver. Alongside that, there can be deeper questioning of previously held assumptions about life, fairness, purpose, or even spirituality. And in terms of interventions, one of the most important approaches is narrative reconstruction. Helping someone to begin to tell their story of what happened and how it fits into the larger story of their life can be a very powerful part of the healing process. We also want to create space for existential exploration. And this includes questions about meaning, purpose, and what life looks like moving forward after the loss. Ultimately, the goal is to support integration, not moving on from the loss, but integrating it into their sense of self, their identity, and their worldview in a way that feels coherent over time. And this is often a gradual process, and one that requires patience and a willingness to sit with complexity. When we're working with older adults, grief unfolds within a different developmental context. This stage of life is often characterized by life review. People are naturally reflecting on their experiences, their relationships, and the meaning of their lives as a whole. Because of that, spiritual reflection is often heightened, whether that takes the form of faith, philosophy, or a broader sense of meaning. And when loss does occur during this stage of life, it can deepen those reflections. It can bring up questions about legacy, purpose, and how one's life fits into a larger story. In terms of interventions, legacy work can be especially meaningful. And this can include storytelling, the passing on of values, or creating something that honors both their life and the life of the person they've lost. We also want to support exploration of life meaning, helping individuals reflect on what has mattered, what continues to matter, and how they want to carry that forward. And for some, this is also a time where spiritual reconciliation or repair becomes important. And that might involve revisiting beliefs, resolving internal conflicts, or finding a renewed sense of peace within their spiritual or existential framework. Overall, our role is to support this process with respect, with curiosity, and a deep appreciation for the richness of their life experiences. So, as we think about supporting people in grief, it's essential that we remain responsive to the wide range of belief systems that may come into the room. For individuals who are faith affiliated, their religious framework can play a significant role in how they experience grief. And for some, it offers comfort and a sense of structure. And for others, it may bring up feelings of guilt or even anger toward God or the religious community. Our approach in these cases is not to challenge or correct the beliefs, especially early on. Instead, we work within their framework. We listen, we explore, we support how their beliefs are interacting with their grief without trying to reshape those beliefs to fit our own understanding. At the same time, we also need to be mindful of those who identify as atheists, agnostics, or religiously unaffiliated, as we've termed the nuns. These individuals may still be deeply engaged in meaning making, but without a formal doctrine or religious structure. Their needs often center around finding meaning without prescribed beliefs and building connections outside of traditional religious communities. In these cases, we can use metaphor and symbolism as tools for exploration. We can focus on legacy, impact, and the ongoing significance of the person who was lost, and we can support the creation of personal rituals that feel authentic to their worldview. So, the key clinical reminder in all of this is that spirituality is not the same as religion, and while belief systems vary widely, the need to make meaning is universal. We all need to have a meaning making process in our lives. And our role is to meet people where they are, not where we expect them to be. So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a few core takeaways to carry into your own work. First, that grief often brings up spiritual questions before there's any emotional resolution. People may be asking deep existential questions while they're still very much in the rawness of their loss. Spiritual wounding is real, it's common, and it's clinically significant. It shows up in the room, whether we name it or not, and it deserves our attention and care. And perhaps most importantly, the role of the clinician or the supporter is not to answer those existential questions. Our role is to hold space where those questions can exist safely, to sit with someone in their own uncertainty without trying to go towards certainty, to tolerate what cannot be resolved just yet, and to support them as they begin to make sense of their experience in their own way and in their own time. So I want to now open it up to any questions, discussion, and then towards the end of the time together, we'll go over Children's Bereavement Center if you're not familiar with us, and how we can offer you all support in the community.
You see, there's a question here. Can you speak about signs clinicians and loved ones should look out for underlying psychological disorders related to grief? For example, at what point is there a concern about hallucinations when seeing a deceased family member?
That's a really great question. I would say first, we need to have a good understanding of the person's medical history and mental health history. Um, if is there any pre-existing conditions related to schizophrenia, to bipolar disorder? Is there any family history that we want to be mindful of that a distressing life event could bring about these psychotic delusions or hallucinations? So we want to all hold that in our mind. I think in the very early stages of a death, in the early times of grieving, it's very hard to differentiate what's what. Um, and this is why we don't make any formal diagnoses in the early parts of grieving. We need some time to differentiate if is this grief, is this something else? So I think this is a process. Most importantly, we want to look out for the person's safety. If they start to feel unsafe to themselves, to others, we do need to intervene. Um, and if you do have concerns that either what you're feeling or what you're experiencing or what you see in a loved one of yours um, feels concerning, I would take it seriously. Um, Reach out to a mental health professional, reach out to a doctor, either your primary care physician or psychiatrist, and get some extra help. There's nothing wrong with a second opinion. But we also don't want to rush towards judgment of what the person is experiencing either. So I think it's a very careful balance, but we all have to use our own discretion and be aware of our own history medically, mentally, as well as our own family history as well.
Any other questions, thoughts, or reflections about some of what was
Um,
discussed today?
Harold has his hand up. I'm gonna give him permission to speak. Harold, would you like to go?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I wonder if my question is more on the basis of for the nuns or even atheists, I'm wondering if how can you be a supportive person in their grief journey if they have no um interpretation of death or like someone died, someone just dies and there's nothing else, there's nothing that comes afterwards, there's no real connection to the deceased or to the person that has passed on or died or whatever language they use. um how can one be a supportive presence for them if there's nothing that they want to even talk to, or if that or if could that become a problem in itself?
Are you speaking to about like they believe that like there's no afterlife, like it's over, like sort of like what's the point in grieving or talking about it?
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Here,
Kendra, do you want to share some thoughts?
sure. I can share some thoughts. I think that's an incredible question. It's important that we ask that. But I think one of the things that we can kind of agree on is that during this time, people need community. It's not necessarily that that community is religious, but that they are surrounded by people who understand that a loss has happened. And so being able to seek out engagement and interactions with people, and also just recognizing that just being a presence is a start. And it's important for anyone, regardless if they are, religious or agnostic or, unaffiliated, it doesn't matter. To the point about there not being an afterlife or belief in an afterlife, that is where kind of dwelling, and I think Dan mentioned this, just roaming in this space of curiosity and the imagination is important because for this individual that may not believe that there is anything beyond this life, building meaning making practices in the here and now are important. And that can take any shape or form that that person feels seems right or sits right with how they understand the world around them. So creating kind of time honored traditions that really does anchor the life of that person in their day to day can be a way to do that. So memory becomes important, not necessarily about thinking about what happens after their life or what happens, now that they're gone, but ways to remember what life was like when they were here can be a way for them to stay grounded in the present because there isn't a belief in anything after. Also, the symbols and just understanding how being rooted in things that don't take on that religious language can be important. And that still can happen even if it's not tied to a particular community of faith. So it's really about creating ways, I think, that people can figure out how to honor the life that was lived. So if that person has a special restaurant, let's just say for an example, you would always just go to it, on their perhaps death anniversary or on their birthday. So it's about honoring like what happened here in this space, and it doesn't put pressure on trying to explain what happens after now. So Dan, I don't know if you have anything additional to add to that, but Harold, I think that's a great question, and I'm very happy that you asked it.
Yeah, I would say grieving is universal. Like whether you identify as atheist, agnostic, Christian, Jewish, whatever, we are all going to grieve. The way we make sense of the grieving and the meaning we construct from it is very different. Um, I was thinking about this after the question and just hearing Kendra talk, and it sounds almost counterintuitive, but if someone who identifies as atheist sort of takes a position of there's no point talking about this. They're gone. There's no afterlife. In a way that I think that takes on a form of spiritual bypassing. That it's a way to not deal with the feelings that are going on now. I respect your belief in that there's no afterlife and it's over, but to say what's the point, um, I would disagree with. I think there's a lot of point in feeling what you're feeling. Um, and if you truly believe that the person is gone and gone forever, then I think there's a deep sadness that needs to be felt and needs to be mourned and integrated. And I think perhaps maybe for some people, the deeply atheistic position can be a way to avoid grief and mourning, because it becomes so concrete, it becomes so intellectualized, and moves outside of the realm of feeling.
Yeah, that's I think great answers to the question. And I recently did a funeral service for you would call them a nun, but they're like non-traditional, non-religious a couple. The husband had died, and I found it incredibly liberating to base the funeral service around storytelling of the person that passed and their memories. And the one thing that grounded me is the quote from Interstellar by Anne Hathaway, who plays Dr. Brandt, where she says that love is the only force in the universe that exists outside of time and space. Because you still love a person even when they're not here. You still feel them. You're still connected to them in the realm of our own consciousness. And that was pretty amazing. And as someone that has done both traditional funerals for in the Christian tradition, and then I did this funeral, it was very freeing almost for me to be in that space. And I think the work that you all are doing are super important. And as a CBC groupie, I'm very happy that this is happening, and it's such good work. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Harold.
We do have two other questions. We have Lorraine, who is asking any suggestions for ways to explain died to a toddler, or an elementary age child.
Mhm. Sure. Yeah, I mean, I just to go back to what we were talking about with the words like passed away or they went to sleep and they didn't wake up. We want to stay away from those types of phrases because it's very confusing and it can be frightening. So we do, as even though it's really hard for us, it's important to use the word died because it's very clear and it allows for conversation of, okay, well, what does died mean? Well, and this may build upon your question, Lorraine, but when someone dies, you can say to a child at that age that their body stopped working. Something very simple as that. Um, and it's very important to just reiterate it's nothing that they did. It's not their fault. This is what happens to people's bodies, either when they're sick or they're old. But you can let them know that they're safe, that they're healthy, that you're healthy, um, and that you're open to hearing anything that they're feeling, what's going on in their head. Um, and usually that's enough for a kid at the beginning, and they'll take time to integrate it, and they might come back with more questions. But you want to be honest, you don't want to lie, but you don't want to overwhelm them with too many details either, especially at that age.
I'll even quickly chime in of also just
Yeah,
asking a child, what do they know about that word, right? Before even
yeah,
delivering the
yeah.
news, right? Like asking them what do they know or what have they heard about that word? Just so that you also have an understanding and you're building off of that understanding and able to also um, kind of get rid of any myths that they may have heard, and provide more clarification to the child. And of course, another way to help bridge a conversation about these things is through movies and through media with children. There's a lot of that. Many Disney movies tackle themes of death, and that can be a good way to help explain to a child uh, the concept of death and dying. So,
Those are great points. Thanks, Bridget.
and then Alyssa does have a question here in terms of counseling within the breadth of religiosity, brought up by the client. If a client wonders if they should explore religious options or say they are considering choosing a different belief system, but asks for our advice or help, what are the laws around to what extent a mental health counselor or licensed therapist can explore that topic with their own knowledge of world religions, and then also if asked about their own private beliefs. So kind
Yeah,
of tackling that conversation.
sure. I'm not quite sure if there's any laws against this. You might want to check your state and your licensing board. I think this gets more into the realm of ethics, of how to engage with a client ethically. If someone, if a client of yours is open to exploring a different belief system or the religious options, I think that's like totally fine. And I think you can engage them in an exploration process and really just approach it from curiosity, interest, openness. I think the struggle is when you start imposing your own belief system on them, or maybe subtly, unconsciously directing them towards where you go to church or temple or, wherever, you worship. Um, so as long as it stays in the realm of focusing on them and helping them to discern what they believe now, this is a form of helping them to create meaning again. And I think it's essential. It's just happening in this form of religious options or belief systems. So as with anything, we want to be careful of our imposing our own belief systems, our own agenda on a client. And it can be tricky, especially if it's a charged subject for us, something we've gone through recently, or it touches a sore spot. So if you feel like that's a sore spot for you, consultation with colleagues can always be useful. But yeah, it's just I think treating it like anything else. If someone was exploring a job option, you engage them in just a process of curiosity and openness, and what's driving that? What feels right about that? What's feels distressing or not bringing you joy currently about your current system? Those would be my thoughts.
And then Alyssa does have a separate question here. In the case of children experiencing grief, if a minor were to be brought to a counselor of a specific religious tradition, and in confidentiality voiced to their counselor or therapist that they may not or do not hold the same religious perspective of their parents. With client-focused treatment, ideally, a practitioner would be able to address and help the child process within their own belief system or absence thereof. However, if their parents or guardians were to learn that we explored the perspective proposed by the child, to what extent do ethics and laws protect the client counselor space, as well as license, both as a therapist or educator, if you have knowledge of the latter? I ask because as a minor, I chose a religious path separate from my parents and was met with this opposition.
Yeah, this is, I think, the very tricky thing of working with minors in a therapeutic space. Um, Technically, the parents or the guardians have access to what's talked about in the counseling session. I think it's really a discernment process for the clinician of how to handle what is talked about in therapy with the minor and how it's shared or not shared with the parent or guardian in the service of ultimately helping the minor. Um, I think minor assent, ASSENT, is very important to let the minor know what remains confidential, what doesn't, what their parents or guardians have access to help protect the minor's own ability to share what they feel comfortable sharing. But it's a very tricky process where you're working with kids at that age. And I think also informing the parents or guardians about the importance of confidentiality in the therapeutic space is really important. Um, of course, they care, they want to know, they're curious, they're concerned, but really helping them understand that as much as this can remain confidential, it ultimately helps the child more, and while also reassuring them that if there's anything, you know, harmful going on to the minor's health or well-being, or that really merits sharing this, the therapist would do so. But that takes trust, that takes time. Some parents, guardians are able to tolerate that, others are not. So it's a balancing act, I would say.
And lastly, we have Anonymous asking, should you apply a trauma-informed care approach to an individual who lost their faith or religious beliefs upon experiencing a significant loss of a loved one?
I personally, I don't see a downside. I think trauma-informed care principles are wonderful and can be used in so many contexts. Um, so I don't necessarily see a downside to that. I think it largely depends how you practice and how you work with people. But the trauma-informed care principles, I think, do a lot of good work, regardless of how you practice, and they help a person feel safe and understood. So I think the extent to which you give it focus is up to you, but I don't see a real harm in applying it if it feels useful.
Let's see. Got a new question here by Lucy asking, how can we address the grieving from a child that comes from the missed experiences with the person who has died? This particular child's father passed away when he was 5, and he does not have many recollections of him.
Mhm. Um, Let me think about that. I mean, I think I would if I was a therapist in that, and the person doesn't have many recollections, I imagine because grieving, we never stop grieving. Grieving is a lifelong thing. It's just learning how to live with it. There's so many life events that are happening, and the child's father is not there. So there's a whole future, I think, imagined future that the child has of what life would be like if dad was there, what experiences they would share. And I think there's a lot that could be discussed around that. And I think also a grieving and sadness that he doesn't have a lot of memories, that the child doesn't have a lot of memories from that point in time when the dad was alive. So I would maybe also see if there's pictures, if there's videos that they can look at together, ask family members about stories, or help get a better sense of who the dad was when he was alive. Um, I think there's aspects of identity building as well. As this child grows up, who I'm assuming it's a boy. Yeah, who is the man he wants to be when he grows up? How did he imagine his father was as a grown man? So there's a lot of big questions around identity building that can come from this particular type of loss. So those are my thoughts. Bridget, I don't know if you have anything on your side.
Yeah, just from my own experience with some of the children that we've worked with at CDC, uh, and those who are very young and don't have recollections of their loved one and the type of work that we do, a lot of it is focused on also just emotions that are felt related to knowing about the death, about not being able to have, right, like future experiences with that person, and exploration of jealousy. That is often one that comes up a lot, even in our elementary groups. So I usually explore some of the emotional aspects, also, right, some of the lost hopes or future with that person, and then again, continued connection and what connection looks like now, or what they wanted it to look like. So again, like what they wanted it to look like, and then how are they, like, what does that look like now post post the death of their loved ones? So that is usually how I've explored it with children who don't have many recollections of the person in their life who has died. But yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Of course, you can raise your hand and ask the question. You can type it in the Q&A. I'd like to thank everyone so far for your engagement and all of these really wonderful questions, thought-provoking questions related to the theme and the topic.
All right. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat at the Q&A or raise your hand. But in the meantime, I'm just going to give a brief overview about who we are if you're not familiar with us and how we can continue supporting you in the community. So for those unfamiliar with the Children's Bereavement Center, we are a 501(c)(3) nonprofit, and we provide free grief support groups for all ages starting as young as 4 years old. We also have Lift from Loss, which is a division of CBC that provides support for young adults and adults. We were founded in 1999, and our clinical team includes national grief experts, thanatologists, mental health professionals, and volunteers as group facilitators. We do service Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach counties, and we also are nationwide through our virtual support system. What we do is we provide free grief support groups, we provide professional grief training, we have online education programs like the Lunch and Learn you're part of now, we host community events, and we have free grief resources on our website. If you're interested in accessing our free grief resources, you can go to our website, childbereavement.org/resources. And there's a bunch of articles that can be downloaded in PDF. There are recorded videos. So there's a lot to check out. About our grief support groups, they are free of cost for all ages starting as 4. So it doesn't cost any money to join. You can come as long as you'd like for as many sessions as you'd like. This is open up to anyone who's lost a loved one as a result of illness, accident, suicide, homicide. So all of our losses are death related in our support groups. Our groups meet weekly online and in person. We have child and teen groups, elementary age, middle school age, high school age. We have young adult groups. We have adult groups in English and Spanish and Creole. And we also have dedicated grief support groups for child loss, perinatal and infant loss. We have legacy groups, and we also have a recently launched pet loss support group. Our groups include activities such as music and art therapy. We offer candle lighting ceremonies throughout the year. Our groups are co-facilitated by mental health professionals and trained volunteers. And our groups are therapeutic, but they're not therapy. So these are support groups, but what we do is very therapeutic. A little information about the support groups. Anyone who's new is required to register. It's a very simple registration process. It doesn't matter when the loss occurred. It could be very recently or years past. You can join whenever you're ready and stay involved for as long as you'd like. We do require parental permission for those under the age of 18. We do ask people to come make a weekly commitment to this and to come on time to the groups. We do have something called the I pass rule, which allows people not to talk if they don't want to talk. If you don't want to talk, you can just say I pass and we move on. What's most important is that we want you to have community. We don't want you to have to be alone with your grief. And as long as you're there, if you want to listen, just if you want to participate, awesome. If not, that's totally cool too. We do welcome people who've lost a significant person in their lives, so it doesn't have to be a family member. It can be anyone who mattered to you. Also, our groups are non-denominational, so we welcome the atheists, the agnostics, the nuns, and anyone who's religiously affiliated. But our groups do not have a religious focus. We are culturally diverse in our groups, and we welcome all identities. Anyone interested in joining a CBC group can call our intake registration number, 888-988-5438. And it's a very quick registration process. You're going to speak with one of our intake staff who'll help get some basic demographic information from you and figure out the best time and of day, the best day and the time to join one of our groups. And then we get you into the group as soon as possible. There's a QR code on the screen if you'd like to scan the QR code to join. There is no referral required, so you don't need a doctor's note, you don't need a therapist note to join. You can self-enroll whenever you're ready just by calling the number or scanning the QR code. If anyone wants to be involved, we always welcome volunteers. You can connect with us through our newsletter. So if you want to subscribe to our newsletter and see all the awesome things we have going on throughout the year, you can go to childbereavement.org and sign up for our newsletter. And if anyone wants to do a fundraiser or make a donation, these help support our grief support groups, our referrals, and allows all of our resources to be completely free. And lastly, for those interested in training and education, we do offer a Lift from Loss Training Institute. So these are interactive grief trainings. We have a 4-part grief informed training series that is free of charge for qualified Florida-based school-based staff, community providers, nonprofit, and mental health professionals. And we offer up to 10 free continuing education credits, provided you complete the training in its entirety. If you have any more information about that, you can send us a message and we can see if you qualify. And this is a very comprehensive introductory training that focuses on how we can support those who are grieving while also supporting ourselves. So we give attention to self-care as well. And that brings us to the end of our presentation. I'll exit and see if anyone has any final comments or questions.
There was one question. I just quickly answered it.
Okay.
About a child whose maybe imaginary friend is a parent, family member, or friend that had recently died. Just the importance of recognizing that imagination and play is very integrated in how children process grief and loss. It's usually through imagination and play rather than kind of direct verbal expression. Or even sometimes crying, right? Outward expressions that we might expect to see in a child. And oftentimes, an imaginary friend can actually reflect a continued bond in that person that they are seeking that connection. It is important to recognize the function of it. And of course, just recognize other behaviors that may be coming out as they continue this kind of relationship with imaginary friend that is representing the loved one. But of course, you can always approach it with curiosity, but validation at the same time, and some reality-based support, but still honoring the child's need for connection and emotional safety. So, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, great response. Well, I want to thank you all for joining us. It was an awesome presentation. Thank you, Kendra. Thank you, Bridget. Thank you all for your contributions and your presence. If you have any follow-up questions, thoughts, feel free to reach out to any one of us and we'd be happy to reconnect. But I wish you all a wonderful day.
Thank you.